Why would inventing a motor irritate anyone? And how did Faraday invent the motor in the first place? Well, I'll tell you, and along the way, I'll talk about a strange theory of spiraling currents, a misunderstanding of electromagnetic forces, and a useless motor. Ready? Let's go.
Electricity, 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 electricity.
In 1820, a Danish man named Ørsted made a remarkable discovery. When current runs through a wire, it can make a compass point in a circle around the wire. Now, a compass is just a thin magnet on a pivot. So Ørsted had proved that electricity and magnetism are linked. What was incredibly confusing to people was that the current went in a straight line and the magnets made a circle around the wire. Ørsted's solution was that maybe the current was really spiraling down the wire. He even made it more complex than that, where a positive current spiraled one way and moved the north end of the compass, and the negative current spiraled the other way and moved the south end of the compass. Woo! This brings us to England and men named Michael Faraday and his mentor, Humphrey Davy. Humphrey Davy was a famous chemist and laughing gas aficionado who was arguably the most famous scientist in all of Europe at the time. 8 years previously, Davy had injured his eye and hired Michael Faraday, a young, uneducated, and poor bookbinder's apprentice, as his assistant. By 1820, Davy was promoted to president of the Royal Institute of London, and Faraday had been promoted to the position of chemical assistant and was conducting some of his experiments independently of Davy. Both Davy and Faraday, and frankly every other scientist in Europe, heard about Ørsted's experiment and tried to figure out what it meant. Davy wrote his brother that, quote, "I've ascertained, repeating some vague experiments of Ørsted's, that the battery is a powerful magnet. I'm deeply occupied in this." Notice that Davy got an important fact wrong about Ørsted's experiment. The battery is not a magnet. It is tempting to think it might be, as if often in a similar shape to a bar magnet, and the plus and minus sign seems so similar to the plus north and south of a magnet. In fact, the battery isn't magnetic, but the current in the wire is. In April, Davy collaborated with his friend William Wollaston on this problem. Wollaston had agreed with Ørsted that the current must spiral down the wire. They spent many hours trying to come up with an experiment to demonstrate the spiraling motion, but to no avail. Supposedly, Faraday heard some of their discussions, but never found them interesting enough to put in his notebook. In the summer of 1821, Faraday was asked to write a review of the latest developments in electricity for a journal. Through painstaking experiments, Faraday determined that the wire wasn't attracting either end of the magnet, but instead orienting the entire magnet. He also determined that the force was purely circular around the wire, not spiraling as Ørsted thought. He decided that, strange as it may seem, the current seemed to travel straight down the wire, and somehow it made a circular force on a magnet around the wire. In return, Faraday also postulated the magnet would make a circular force on a wire around it. In other words, quote, a wire ought to revolve around a magnetic pole, and a magnetic pole round the wire. Faraday began looking for a way to demonstrate that current-carrying wire will feel a force around a magnet. On September 3rd, 1821, he created a simple experiment in his laboratory to demonstrate this force. He had a wire drop down into a cup full of mercury. Mercury is conducting fluid, with a permanent bar magnet in the center. When he closed the switch, the current ran through the wire and the wire spun continuously. Supposedly, Faraday shouted, quote, there they go, we have succeeded at last." Technically, Faraday had just invented the electric motor, as an electric motor is a device that changes electricity into motion. Of course, it wasn't a particularly practical motor, as it didn't do any useful work, unless you wanted to electrically stir mercury. Luckily, Faraday didn't invent the motor to do any work. He invented it to demonstrate the current moves in a straight line and the magnetic force is circular. As a motor, it was useless. As a demonstration of the nature of magnetic fields, it was quite efficient. Faraday published his work in October to great acclaim. But within a week, he heard rumors that people were saying he plagiarized his material. The person shouting this the loudest was his former boss and mentor, Humphrey Davy. Faraday wrote to Wollaston, quote, "I'm anxious to escape from the unfounded impressions against me, and if I have done any wrong, I may apologize for it." Wollaston wrote back and claimed to be unoffended. However, Wollaston didn't publicly defend Faraday, and Davy publicly attacked him. It's hard to know, almost 200 years after the fact, why people did what they did and how they felt about it. Most modern researchers feel that Davy was jealous of his protege's success and felt that Faraday was too low caste and uneducated to be an independent researcher. However, it's possible that Davy felt justified in his anger. Faraday was a person that Davy had plucked from obscurity, and he did not to give credit to his benefactor. And it's true that Davy and Wollaston had been trying to making spinning device before Faraday did, although with different motivation. Finally, it isn't clear that Davy really understood what Faraday was proving with his experiments. Davy's brother stated that his objections to Faraday were an act of justice to Dr. Wollaston. It's quite possible that Davy felt that way for the rest of his life. In May of 1823, Faraday was nominated to be a Fellow of the Royal Institute, to the strong objection of Davy. 3 years later, Davy fell ill from using too much laughing gas, or from inhaling dangerous chemicals in a laboratory, and resigned from his job as chemist. He passed away 3 years later. For the next 10 years, Faraday was eager to continue his studies in electricity, but instead he was basically forced by the government to study how to make better optical glasses, a study that he found particularly fruitless, stating the only results were his own nervous headaches. Meanwhile, Faraday's paper was read far and wide. One person to read Faraday's paper was a newly retired soldier and bootmaker named William Sturgeon. Sturgeon read Faraday's paper and actually made one of the first practical motors, albeit 13 years after Faraday. But he first focused on another thing Faraday mentioned in his paper, that a helix of wire acts like a bar magnet. How Sturgeon invented the first practical electromagnet is next time on The Secret History of Electricity.
Electricity, 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 electricity.